beat off 11,000 Zulu attackers. Inside the circled laager, the women and children were frantically reloading the guns while the men fired them out between the wheels. The bodies of the Zulus piled high around the laager, and after the battle had finished, 3,000 of them were found to have died, whereas only 2 of the Boers inside the laager had been killed. An enormous disparity in casualties, and one of the founding myths of the Afrikaner peoples of the 19th and 20th century. The river itself was renamed the Blood River, and the Battle of Blood River itself became an event for annual celebration. Dingaan himself fled, and the body of Piet Retief, who had been killed by Dingaan, was discovered at the King's Kraal. The town of Pietermaritzburg was founded in honour of 2 of these Boer martyrs, Piet Retief himself and Gerrit Maritz. And similarly, if you look at the place names in South Africa today, especially the interior of South Africa, you can very often find the names of the Voortrekker leaders. Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, is named after Andries Pretorius, who's another of the Trek leaders. Well, the trekkers made another expedition into Zululand, deposed Dingaan, and made Mpande the king of the Zulus instead. And Mpande was more conciliatory than his 2 predecessors, Dingaan and Chaka, had been. He ruled for over 30 years and was one of the very, very few Zulu kings to actually die peacefully of old age. Here's a description by a French explorer of going to meet him. On mats laid on the floor lay 10 naked girls with firm and velvety contours. One was supporting his head with her body, a living pillow whose breathing induced a sleep of opium dreams. Another supported his right arm. A third was still grasping his left hand and resting his temple on her large bosom. Another supported the right leg, and a 5th girl was lying across the left leg. They were all asleep. Well, the travellers are understandably fascinated by this scene. The English established trading relations with the Boers and with the Zulus, but the warrior society remained intact. The Boers and the British both wanted labour. They wanted Zulus to work for them. But in fact, they found that although they could hire African labourers from north of Zululand, they couldn't persuade the Zulus themselves to compromise themselves and move into paid labour for the whites. So the Zulus remain a warrior kingdom in the midst of this white settlement, even though for the moment they're on peaceful terms. Christian missionaries active in Africa, as in the West Indies, found it almost impossible to make Zulu converts. One of the men who tried particularly hard was John William Colenso, the Bishop of Natal, who arrived in South Africa in 1853. He learned the Zulu language and was determined to make a written version of it and then to translate the Bible into it so that the Zulus could learn to read and become Christians. But a very interesting thing happened as he was involved in this project. His Zulu assistants began to ask him questions about difficult and puzzling passages of the Old Testament. And that in turn caused him to start wondering about its literal accuracy. In other words, its religious effect was at least as great on him as it was on his ostensible converts. And finally, in 1862, he published a book called A Critical Examination of the Pentateuch, in which he advanced the theory that Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, as was then widely believed, that in fact the Old Testament could be seen as the gathering together of a lot of older documents whose evolutionary history could itself be traced. This is part of the process in the 19th century of the historical critical study of Scripture. It scandalised the Church of England, particularly its old guard, the people who assumed or took for granted that the Bible was the literal revealed Word of God. But on the other hand, it did win the admiration of some of the younger ones. This is 1862, just 3 years after Charles Darwin had published his own great book on the origin of species by natural selection, when the whole possibility of the Bible's accuracy on questions like the antiquity of the earth were being called into question. Bishop Colenso was put on trial for heresy and excommunicated after being found guilty. But then the civil courts in South Africa said that the Bishop of Cape Town did not have authority over the Bishop in the Diocese of Natal, with the result that Colenso stayed on. Later on, as we'll see, he became a leading critic of British policy in the area. Britain took over direct control of Natal in 1842 because of its strategic significance. This is the southeasterly part of Africa, which actually borders onto the Indian Ocean. On the other side of the Drakensberg Mountains, further west from Natal, the Boers established two independent republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. As you go north in South Africa, you cross the Orange River, and that's the area of the Orange Free State. Then if you go further north, you cross the Vaal River, and that's the Transvaal, which just means across the Vaal River. They were given diplomatic recognition by Britain in 1852 and 54, and for the moment at least, they were left alone. The Boers lived on isolated farms, using black labour in a condition that was really very close to slavery, and they were Calvinist fundamentalists, sticking to their traditional interpretation of the Bible. The Zulu kingdom persisted as well through the mid-19th century, and undertook limited trading exchanges with the British and the Boers. One English settler called John Donne was actually invited to live among the Zulus in 1856, and he went native. He took 48 Zulu wives, had more than 100 children, guided British visitors who came to visit him, led hunting parties in the area, and traded among the Zulus, bringing them guns, which they couldn't make, but whose value they appreciated, and bringing exotic animal skins for use in rituals and to enhance the prestige of leaders, usually in exchange for hardy, disease-resistant African cattle. That was the situation in the mid-century, but everything was destabilised in 1868 by the discovery of diamonds, which suddenly gave a new importance to the interior of southern Africa and provoked renewed conflict between the Britons, the Boers and the Zulus. It was at Kimberley that the diamonds were discovered in 1868 on the western edge of the Orange Free State. Disraeli, the Conservative Prime Minister, his Minister of the Colonies, Lord Carnarvon, suggested a confederation of all the South African provinces in 1875 for defence, labour movement, food supply, free trade and so on. Because now it's suddenly become important to get supplies up to Kimberley, previously an inaccessible place, because of the flourishing diamond business. And he denied that the Boer republics had been granted full independence from British sovereignty. This was a diplomatic grey area. He sent Sir Theophilus Shepstone, the Secretary of Native Affairs in Natal, to Pretoria in the hope of arranging a coup. And the British, between them, declared the Transvaal to be annexed back to the British Empire. Shepstone managed it without a shot being fired. This is in 1877. And the Boers put up with this high-handedness on the British part because they were very anxious about the revival of Zulu military power, and they could foresee that they might very well be in need of British military protection. Shepstone, meanwhile, who'd also been friendly to Mpande, the Zulu leader, now took the side of the Transvaal in a border dispute with the new Zulu king Cetshwayo, after earlier seeming to be sympathetic to the Zulu position. And that led to them feeling betrayed by him as an old friend of Cetshwayo's father. This is a situation in which Sir Bartle Frere came to South Africa as the new High Commissioner. He wanted to enlarge British South Africa, and he wanted to incorporate the Zulus as a native labour force. He said, a united South Africa can never be secure so long as it's got an independent warrior kingdom right in its heart. And he sent to Cetshwayo an ultimatum, telling him, disband your military system in 30 days or else face an invasion of the British Army. In retrospect, an outrageous and completely unjustified claim to have made. Cetshwayo ignored the ultimatum, with the result that in 1879, January, a British column under the leadership of Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand. Now, Cetshwayo had an army, even though his predecessor Mpande had been relatively much more peaceful than Dingaan and Chaka, nevertheless the Zulu was still a very, very ferocious fighting force. It had an army 30,000 strong, an incredible number in a pre-industrial society, showing what a very high degree of internal organisation the Zulu kingdom had. Very well organised and very disciplined. The British commander Lord Chelmsford underestimated the Zulus, and at Isandlwana he paid the price. He divided his force, leaving 1,000 men in camp without a properly fortified position. They were attacked and overrun by a group of 20,000 of the Zulu warriors. All but 55 of the British soldiers were killed and their bodies horribly mutilated. A letter from an army batman, Elias Tucker, says, they cut everyone up and took his heart and laid it on his breast and put his right hand in where they took his heart from. So there's a sort of wave of revulsion in Britain at the sudden massacring of a British military column. Nearby, at a place called Rorke's Drift, 100 British soldiers, alerted by the tragedy of Isandlwana, made a heroic defence against 4,000 more Zulus who were pressing the attack. And the fact that they won this engagement enabled them to forestall an invasion of Natal itself. The incident at once became famous through Elizabeth Butler's painting of the defence of Rorke's Drift. And more recently, if you've ever seen the film called Zulu, a Michael Caine film, that's the incident which is depicted there, the defence of Rorke's Drift. Quechua was probably mistaken to make frontal attacks. They were too costly in the men's lives. Ambushes would have served him better. And when they made ambushes, they were usually very effective. In one ambush, the Zulus killed the French Prince Imperial. This was the son of the Emperor Napoleon III, who'd volunteered for service in the British Army in search of adventure. He died from 17 wounds, and his mutilated body was found. But his family derived a measure of pride from the fact that all the wounds are on the front of his body, showing that he died facing his enemy. Now again, I think it's interesting to think about what's happening at just the same time in America. This is just 3 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when for the very last time a group of American Indians, the Sioux and the Cheyenne, were able to win a victory over the more industrialized army of their opponents, but then forced to disperse very quickly after their victory. Just as the Little Bighorn wasn't repeated, so the British were able to follow up and avenge their defeat. Chelmsford avenged himself at Isandlwana and saved his own reputation by advancing on the Zulu capital of Ulundi and annihilating the Zulu army for a loss of only 13 men. His army in red uniforms advanced in squares, bristling with rifles and bayonets in every direction, and supported by artillery and by Gatling guns, early machine guns, so that Ulundi became a massacre. There was an indignant liberal outcry in Britain at the British provocation of the war by Bartle Frere, and then the killing of the wounded Zulus at Ulundi, and the apparent glee of British soldiers as they did so. One of the leaders of the protest against this treatment of the Zulus was Bishop Colenso himself. He was infuriated by British duplicity in provoking the war. And on the official day of commemoration, he preached from the text, "And what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God?" And in his sermon he said, "I repeat, wherein, in our invasion of Zululand, have we shown that we are men who love mercy? Did we not lay upon the people heavily, from the very moment we crossed their border, the terrible scourge of war? Have we not killed already, it is said, 5,000 human beings, and plundered 10,000 head of cattle? It is true that in that dreadful disaster, on account of which we are this day humbling ourselves before God, we ourselves have lost very many precious lives, and widows and orphans, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, are mourning bitterly their sad bereavements. But are there no griefs, no relatives that mourn their dead in Zululand? Have we not heard how the wail has gone up in all parts of the country for those who have bravely and nobly died in repelling the invader and fighting for their king and fatherland?" Bishop Colenso there is unusual in showing a sympathy for an enemy which he says has been betrayed in the first place and wronged, and is just as deserving of the sympathy of intelligent British people as the Britons themselves whose loved ones have been lost. Well, in an ironic sequel to the battles of Isandlwana and Ulundi, the Boers, having been rescued from their fear of the Zulus, who from this time were never again able to launch an effective attack against the British, the Boers now decided that they themselves didn't want anymore the intervention of the British. And so they rebelled when a new Prime Minister, William Gladstone, did not revoke Disraeli's annexation of the Orange Free State in the Transvaal, as his opposition speeches in 1877 had led them to expect that he was going to do. Paul Kruger, who'd been a child during the Great Trek and had lived his life there in the African backcountry, led the rebellion, the Boer Rebellion of 1881, and it humiliated a British force at the Battle of Majuba Hill, killing and wounding nearly 300 British soldiers for the loss of one man. Testimony to the power of surprise and to good marksmanship. Kruger himself had been with Lord Chelmsford at Isandlwana 2 years earlier and had warned him to fortify his camp. Chelmsford had ignored the advice, and his troops had paid the consequence by being massacred. Now another British commander, Sir George Colley, made the same mistake. At this point, Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, reversed himself again, and rather than launch a big campaign to avenge Majuba Hill, permitted the Transvaal and the Orange State to regain their independence. But after the Battle of Ulundi, the Zulus did begin to go to work for the British in the 1880s and 90s, and the situation in South Africa was going to be further destabilised, as we'll see later on, by the development of the great gold mining industry around Johannesburg.